Welcome to page 84 of Anatomy Coloring Book. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins. We finished talking about the cranial nerves. Those were the nerves that exited from the brainstem area and up in the cranial area, in the nerves of the cranium. Now, below the cranium, the skull, below the skull is the spine. These are what we're talking about now, are nerves that exit below the cranium in the spine area. So we're going to talk about, and these are part of the peripheral nervous system, and so were the cranial nerves for that matter. They're part of the peripheral nervous system. And so we're going to talk about what happens when neurons exit the spinal column. Okay. So using this diagram right here, this is a vertebrae. Let's see if we can color the vertebrae. We'll color it brown. This is a vertebrae. This is your backbone, one of the bones of your backbone. Right here. This is the vertebral body, the body of the vertebrae. This in here is the disc. You've heard of a disc, you've heard of disc herniations. And here's another vertebra and a vertebral body. And notice in between, these vertebrae are stacked on top of each other, but in between is this area right here where the nerves are exiting, in this area right here. And of course there would be another vertebra below this. And these vertebrae exit at a very vulnerable, very tight place, and you can see from this diagram how tight this area is here. Not a whole lot of room. It's pretty small area there for these nerves to leave. So it's a very vulnerable area of the body. And that's where we encounter a lot of problems, disc herniations and sciatica and lots of these different maladies. But here is the spinal cord. So the brain would be up here. The spinal cord sends messages through the spinal cord down here, and you can see this is the gray matter right here and the white matter on the outside. And these messages come from neurons down, and these neurons come from the brain down, and the neurons come out through these what are called roots, spinal roots, or the anterior root, and they would come back in, messages come back in through the posterior root here. And they would meet, these two roots meet up in a place right here called the spinal nerve. And then they would, or in a place here to here called the spinal nerve, right here. And then they branch out to the body through the, what's called a rami. Ramus or rami. That's the posterior rami, dorsal rami. And here's the anterior rami, or the ventral rami. Rami is plural for ramus. All right. So now let's look, if we were to take a slice, right here, slice. Take a slice of this and expand it out. What would that look like? Cross-section view. Well, here is that vertebral body, the vertebrae, the bone. Here's more of the bone back here. It's got a funny shape to it. It's got like wings to it. Got a process. That's your backbone that you can feel out here. When you push on somebody's spine, you can feel the bone back there. And of course, here inside is the spinal cord itself. And let's see, the spinal cord right here. Here's your spinal cord. Remember the gray matter? These are where the cell bodies lie. Here's the posterior horn. And here's the anterior horn up here. So watch what happens here. So the signals come from the brain. They come down. And this is the front of the body. This is the anterior. This is the anterior horn of the gray matter, or the ventral horn. And the signals in the neurons with their cell bodies here will exit this the spinal cord in a little area called the root. This is the dorsal root right here. Excuse me, the anterior root. I'm going to circle it right here. That's the anterior root. If you look up here, the anterior root is here and here. Let me clear that out. This is the anterior root right here. You can see the nerves exiting through here, the neurons with the anterior root. And here's the same description right here. And the anterior root travels all the way up here, where it is joined with the dorsal root. The dorsal root contains sensory information going inward. So the dorsal root carries sensory information in. And this is called the dorsal root ganglion, where all the cell bodies are. And the sensory information, this afferent information, comes in through the dorsal root into the dorsal horn, or the posterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord. So, information leaves here through the anterior horn, through the anterior root. Excuse me. Let's see. From the dorsal horn, the anterior root, and then meets up and joins the posterior root, or the dorsal root, and becomes a new structure right here. This new structure right here, called the spinal nerve. When they both join together, it's called the spinal nerve. And the spinal nerve ends right here. And what it leaves from the spinal nerve is the ramus, the anterior ramus. Here, going to the front of the body, the muscles and nerves and glands and everything to the front of the body, and the posterior ramus, or the muscles and joints and glands at the back. So we've got three separate and distinct structures here. And let's point them out up top. We have these separate and distinct structures. The roots, the nerve roots, the posterior and anterior. The rami, the ramus, and the spinal nerve itself. Okay. So, the posterior root is in blue here, and the posterior right here. Posterior root. The anterior root is what I've diagrammed in red. The spinal nerve I've outlined in light blue. The anterior ramus I have outlined in green. And the posterior ramus I have outlined in purple. So let's go through this again on the other side. Information, sensory information might come in from this direction here. It'll come in through an afferent sensory neuron. It'll come through the spinal nerve here. Let's say it comes through the back right here. Through the spinal nerve, through the dorsal root ganglion, where its cell bodies are, pass through the dorsal root and into the posterior horn of the spinal cord, the gray matter of the spinal cord. That's sensory information. That's afferent. Then signal, and that might be, you put your hand on a flame and it says ouch. So your brain might send a signal down to the anterior horn motor to tell your muscle to move your hand out of the way. So from the anterior horn of the spinal cord, the signal will come outward, the anterior root, to the spinal nerve, through the spinal nerve, and we'll go tell your muscle to move. Excuse me. And then back through the root and the ramus. So let's go through that one more time. I think I left one part out, which is the ramus. So sensory information might come in through a nerve, a peripheral nerve, then through the say posterior or primary ramus, through the spinal nerve, the dorsal root ganglion, the root, the posterior root, and then last the posterior horn. Motor information, efferent signal going out to the muscle would start at the anterior ramus, the anterior horn, the spinal cord. The anterior horn signal will come from the brain to the anterior horn, through the anterior root, through the spinal nerve, and then out through the posterior primary ramus, or the anterior primary ramus, whichever muscle it's heading to innervate. Point being, it passes through multiple spots. So that's what I want to review. The signal will pass through the anterior or posterior horn, the dorsal root ganglion, or the posterior root or the anterior root, through the spinal nerve here, and then out through the posterior primary ramus or the anterior primary ramus. And you could see how if there's any trouble, let's say with age and degeneration, if there's a bony growth, say right down here, an osteophyte, if the bone starts to overgrow, or if the disc begins to protrude, you can see how it put pressure on these dorsal or anterior roots and or the spinal nerve over here. You see how this is a very dangerous area and can cause a lot of pain with degeneration and disc injuries. All right, let's go through the same scenario with a different diagram. And I'm repeating this many times because it's so important. All right, so here is the spinal nerve down here where the two meet, where the two roots meet, yes? And let's say you touch fire down here, and you touch it. Well, a signal is going to be sent through this rami, dorsal ramus, okay? It splits off here too. So this will be the dorsal ramus over here, and this will be the anterior ramus over here. So through the dorsal ramus, a signal comes in, an afferent signal, a sensory signal. It travels along this neuron right here, and here's the cell body where all the nutrients and things come from, and the chromosomes and where the cells divide. And the signal comes all the way up and through to where? It's a sensory signal. It's an afferent nerve, so it goes through to the dorsal horn, or the posterior horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord in here. And of course, that signal goes up to the brain and says, ouch. So the brain is going to send a signal back down, right? An efferent signal, a motor signal coming back down here to where? The anterior horn of, because it's motor. The motor horn is the anterior horn. And that signal, here's the cell body of the new neuron, is going to come outward now. It's an efferent signal. It's a motor signal to come out to the body. And it could go to the front part of the body, or it can go to the back part of the body. So this is the anterior ramus. And of course, here is the posterior ramus. The posterior ramus here. So the point being is this. You will find sensory afferent neurons in the posterior root and in the posterior horn. But in the spinal nerve, you will find a combination of both. Look in this area here. Notice in this area here, I'm circling, I have both blue and red. I have both sensory and motor neurons. Now, so the dorsal root contains only sensory. The anterior root contains only motor neurons. But as we go down, there can be sensory signals coming from the front of the body that will cross over in the spinal nerve and go to the posterior horn. And there can be motor signals coming from the anterior horn to go to the posterior part of the body or the front of the body. So the spinal nerve contains a mix. Notice this. The spinal nerve contains a mix of both sensory and motor neurons, whereas the roots contain only one or the other. And the rami also contain a mix. And while we're here, let's talk about the different parts of the vertebra. We talked about the vertebral body. Here, this is the body of the vertebra. The lamina is this area right here. This little section of the bone. In this little section of the bone right here. That's the lamina. We talked about the body. Transverse process are the wings, sort of the vertebra. Looks like they're defined right about here. Up here, here's a transverse process. It's this bony portion of the vertebra that sticks out. It's like a wing. That's the transverse process. The spinal canal, of course, is the big canal, the big hole that the spinal cord runs through. And the lateral recess is this tight little area right here, this little canal right here, where the dorsal root ganglion and the spinal nerve lie, and the roots. They come through this lateral recess. Spinal canal lateral recess. More specifically, though, this area here is the intervertebral foramen. Foramen means a hole. And the lateral recess is more specifically this area right here to the side of the spinal cord. This is the lateral recess here. And this is the intervertebral foramen. And this concludes a lesson on spinal nerves and nerve roots. This is Dr. Stephen Harkins.